welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. Revolution 250 is a consortium of about 70 groups in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of the American Revolution. I'm Bob Allison. I am the co-chair of the Rev 250 advisory group, and our guest today is Cassandra Good. Welcome, Cassandra.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Cassandra Good is an historian and a writer. She's right now an associate professor of history at Marymount University in Washington. She's also taught at George Washington University and at the University of Mary Washington. She's actually from the Washington, D.C. area. And at Mary Washington, she also was an associate editor of the papers of James Monroe. After getting her doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, she worked at the Smithsonian. She was the director of, or manager of public programs and scholarly publications and public programs, I think was the title. Anyway, I have more things I could say about you, but let's get to you and your books. Your first book was Founding Friendships, which really is a novel, innovative way of looking at relationships among people in the founding era. And your new book is First Family, George Washington's Heirs in the Making of America. So so this is a fascinating book. You're looking at, we know Washington, father of his country, his wife Martha. They're, I hate to use the word icons, but they are iconic in American history. And then we know much less about the family that they had around them, because they didn't have children of their own, but Martha brought with her 2 children from her first marriage. Her others had died in infancy, and those become Washington's surrogate children, and then the grandchildren they also raise.
Right. And, most people, when they think about George Washington, they think he had no children. And he's portrayed as, and even in some of the famous lines about him from eulogies, that he had no children.
Yeah.
And so Americans, you were all Washington's children.
Yeah.
And that's really a narrow definition of having children. That's, having biological children, which he did not have. But he raised a lot of children in addition to these 2 stepchildren from Martha and the grandchildren. There are nieces and nephews coming out of his house all the time. But he's really the key father figure, first for Jackie and Patty, the children of Martha from her first marriage, and then for Jackie's children, especially the younger 2, Nellie and Wash, who were basically adopted by the Washingtons. There was no legal form of adoption, but they were raised at Mount Vernon and then in the president's house with George and Martha as their parents, essentially.
So what was childhood like then for, first for Jackie and his sister, and then for, the 2 grandchildren, Nellie and Wash, who come in? And by the way, his name was George Washington Parke Custis.
Yes, and that's why I say Wash, because it's a mouthful to say the full name there. And they all have Park in their middle name as part of a long family tradition. But, for Jackie and Patty moving there, they were young children at the point that they moved to Mount Vernon. The house was much smaller when they moved there. They're living, in some sense, the life of fairly upper crust Virginia planters because of Martha's money, not because of George's money. And as they're growing up, of course, George is involved in some political and some military action, so he's not always there. Martha is clearly the primary parent here until Jackie goes to school. And that's fairly normal at this period, that the mother is going to do the primary parenting until the kid goes to school. And then you see these struggles. Jackie was not a great student, and is not able to finish college despite his stepfather's great efforts to get him to finish college.
Right. Yeah.
And he ultimately drops out to get married very young, and quickly have a bunch of children.
Yeah, he has a lot of children. He has, he does. And then his widow goes on to have 4, they have 7. And then she goes on to have 14 more with her second husband. And
right. And not all these children survive.
Right.
But yeah, and this is probably part of why she died fairly young, is just having that many
Right.
children.
Yeah.
There was a sense, that her body had sort of worn
Right.
down at a certain point. But yes, she was very young when she got
hmm
married. And so
hmm
she was having children and grandchildren basically at
hmm
the same time because of the span in ages.
Right.
And we don't know that much about her children with her second
hmm
husband. Some of their letters survive. They sometimes show up with the Custis
hmm
grandchildren. They clearly do have a relationship, but they're
hmm
not publicly known the way the Custis grandchildren are,
Right. Right.
because the Custis grandchildren are around when George Washington is president.
Right.
And even the elder two, so I said Nellie and Wash are basically adopted
hmm
by George and Martha.
hmm
The elder two, Eliza and Patty, spend time in the president's house in Philadelphia. They come to
hmm
visit. People know who they are. They are also famous.
Right.
And, so because of this time in the 1790s and the presidency, they are really the nation's first family.
hmm And do they get a lot of attention then as they're growing up as the first family?
Absolutely. Nellie and Wash more so.
hmm
They're participating even, in New York when they first get there. There's this huge welcoming
hmm
parade. They're participating in public events. So just like we expect now when the president goes to a big ceremonial event, often his
hmm
family comes with him.
Yeah.
That was happening at this point.
hmm
We know that Wash dressed in like some kids' army regimentals
Wow.
to be in a
hmm
parade. Um, Nellie constantly had people asking her to play music, asking to see examples of her art.
hmm
She's famous enough that at the end of the presidency, we know there are wax figures of George Washington.
Yeah.
There's also Martha, but there's a place that has Nellie too.
Wow.
She's
Wow.
famous enough, she gets a wax figure. So I think that gives you some sense of her celebrity.
Yeah. And then as adults, they all buy or they marry and they purchase land around what becomes the city of Washington, usually on hills in Georgetown and Alexandria and Arlington. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what they're doing then as adults in this new nation, which is really the focus of your book.
Yeah, so actually two of them inherit the land. So
hmm
Nellie marries George Washington's nephew, Lawrence Lewis, who interestingly is the one who was supposed to look the most like George.
Hmm.
Read into that what you will.
Yeah.
But George gave them, he basically had 5 farms in Mount Vernon. He gave
hmm
them one of the farms, and they turned that into Woodlawn Plantation
Okay.
and built a house there. And then Wash inherited land of his father's that his father had bought along the Potomac River in what is now Arlington. And Arlington was part of Washington, D.C. at this point.
hmm
Which has implications in several ways for him that we can
hmm
talk about in terms of the
Yeah.
laws and whether he can vote
hmm
and how enslaved people are treated. So he gets a plot of land there, and he also inherits a huge amount of land in the Tidewater, Virginia. And that is actually the main source of his income. And then we have Patty, who marries Thomas Peter. And yes,
hmm
they buy a plot of land in Georgetown that is pretty much the highest point in Georgetown. And supposedly you could see across from their house that they built there to Arlington House,
Oh,
Wash's
wow.
house. They supposedly could flag to each other
Mm.
between these houses. You can't, because of the trees now,
hmm
see between the two,
hmm
but they're fairly close to each other. And then Eliza, the eldest, marries this man, Thomas Law,
hmm
and he's basically a real estate developer in
Yeah.
DC. So they moved to a bunch of
Mhm.
different houses. One of them that is often called the honeymoon house that they lived in right after they got married is still standing
Mhm.
and is on the Southwest waterfront in DC, has recently been restored by a private owner.
Hmm.
But after her separation from her husband, she also bought a farm of her own that she called Mount Washington.
Oh, wow.
Not on as big of a hill,
No.
but in Alexandria, and it is now part of the campus of the Episcopal School. So that building is still there. But then
Wow.
after that, she's basically peripatetic, does not have
Oh,
her
yeah.
own home.
Yeah.
the
Well,
rest
it's
of her
very
life.
unusual to divorce in that period, too.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, they initially separate versus
Mhm.
divorcing,
hmm
in part because there's ways that it's better for a woman at that time. First of all, with the custody arrangement, they had a child.
hmm
Men automatically got custody in a divorce
Oh.
at that point. The other thing is that there's less public notoriety. And so they have a separation agreement, a legal agreement
hmm
that male family members sign on her behalf.
hmm
And actually, when she buys that farm, she has to, show yes, I'm married to Thomas Law, but this has nothing to do with him. I'm separated from him. She lives there a few years. And then Thomas Law at a certain point decides he wants a divorce, perhaps
Hmm.
because he's thinking of marrying again. And she is not happy.
Hmm.
It does bring additional notoriety. It was bad
All right.
enough with the gossip when they separated. But then when they get divorced, she says everybody in Washington has heard that the divorce has gone through before she even finds out.
Wow.
And she starts going by her maiden name again, but Mrs. So she's Mrs. Custis, and is, kind of notorious because of this.
She has a number of interesting relationships later on with these various unscrupulous foreigners who show up. Not to cast aspersions on unscrupulous foreigners, but kind of
yes.
adventurers.
Right. There are these adventures coming through DC, especially, although one of them actually had started out in Boston around the time of the War of 1812, doing things like trying to sell intelligence to the US government that is faulty, or trying to secretly foment a rebellion in some territory, or trying to escape going to jail in their home country.
Yeah.
She's got several people that she meets and befriends where that's the situation, including this French guy, Francois Denis de Greff, who had gotten in trouble for gambling in the French military and gets kicked out and comes over to the US. And everybody else seems to know that he's a fake, except Eliza is, convinced he's a real deal. She also loves the French to the point that, she thinks Napoleon is okay, which is a pretty extreme position.
And her siblings disagree about that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and she's the only one who's a Democratic Republican.
Okay.
The siblings are all Federalists, and so they definitely don't agree on politics.
She'd also been friendly with Aaron Burr, as I recall.
Yeah. She was good friends with Aaron Burr. And in the letter he wrote to his daughter before the duel with Hamilton, the last thing he says in there is, tell Mrs. Custis hello.
Wow.
So, clearly they were close friends. And I don't think she was ever particularly close with Jefferson, but she does become close with the Madisons.
Yeah. And de Greff she compares to her grandfather.
Yes, right. That to try and legitimize things. But also, he, for some reason I've never been able to figure out, he goes back to France and supposedly needs to get approval from the military. He's trying to get his commission back, and he needs to get approval to get married. And he says, I'm marrying George Washington's granddaughter as a sort of, he's not given permission. And he ends up dying by suicide, which Eliza blames on all the stories spreading about terrible things he has done, including by a French-American friend of hers, whose house she will later show up at and die. She's got a very dramatic life.
Yeah, it really is. It's really fun. We're talking with Cassandra Good, who is an historian, author of First Family. Then the research for this book, you did a tremendous amount, but it was supported by grants from Mount Vernon, as well as the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And phenomenal research. I mean, untangling this, tracing these people through generations and actually getting these extraordinary stories. And
I mean, it took a dozen years of research. I first started working on this that long ago. And that's part of why it took, fellowship funding to do this. But, a lot of the material is at Mount Vernon. While they don't have that much original George Washington correspondence, they have all the Custis family stuff, or a lot of it. The other biggest collection is at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, much of which is in this collection that had been in these trunks that were in a bank vault until about 20 years ago. And they were not made available until the last 10 or so years, I think. So there's a lot of material in there.
Wow. So
the other thing that took a long time to piece together was the slavery aspect of this, because these are some of the largest enslavers in Virginia, and the bulk of the people enslaved at Mount Vernon end up with the Custises still in slavery. And so tracing them hadn't really done before.
Yeah, and that's phenomenal too, because there are family relationships among the enslaved people as well as among the enslaved people and the Custises. And then with George and Martha's death, George sets free his enslaved people. He can't free the Custis slaves, and then they're divided up.
Right.
Not according to family, but according to who gets whom.
Yeah, I mean, some of the families are kept together, but then you can see that the Custises are dividing the dower slaves, we call them, 4 ways, and there's plenty of families that get split up, and they don't seem to be very concerned about that. They show no interest in emancipating all of the enslaved people. Now, both Wash and Eliza do emancipate some people. From what I can tell, they're mostly emancipating people they're related to.
Wow.
Because Eliza and her husband Thomas emancipate a man named William Costin and his extended family. There's pretty good evidence that William Costin was the Custis's half-brother, that Jackie had a child by an enslaved woman named Anne or Nancy Holmes. And it's a complicated story. There's been a lot of sort of misinformation or misunderstanding about who exactly this woman was that I think we still haven't fully untangled. But William Costin becomes a very prominent Black citizen in Washington, becomes a property owner, owns multiple homes, stays in touch with the Custises. He works for the bank and is very well respected in the city. And it seems, he was born into slavery and freed and probably the half sibling.
So he would have been then Jackie's son, that is Washington's stepson's son. And and then he marries a woman named Philadelphia Judge, and her
and it's her sister Ona Judge. If you've read Never Caught, this story about the enslaved woman who freed herself from the president's house in Philadelphia and makes it up to New Hampshire, and really remarkable story. And Philadelphia, or Delphi, was also a dower slave. And so it, maybe that Costin actually met her in Eliza Custis's household. We don't really know. But they have children, and those children are freed also a little bit after Costin gets freed.
Okay. It's fascinating. These fascinating connections that you're able then to piece out and give us a much fuller picture of who these people are and what life was like. I mean, sometimes you have a famous family, but they give us really a window into what life was like for people who weren't related to George Washington. But for them, that's the one thing they keep having, even though it doesn't really bring them that much in the New Republic, I think.
I mean, it brings them at least the white family celebrity, right? I think in terms of, for Costin, for instance, if people knew he was related to the Custises in his lifetime, nobody recorded it in a way I've ever found. But soon after, there's a record in writing. But for the white family members, they can't necessarily get political power directly from this because 3 out of the 4 of them are women. So they can't get elected political power. I would argue they get other kinds of political power and influence. They know the presidents, they know the people in power. They can sort of represent their positions as the Washington legacy and be taken seriously in that sense. Wash Custis is the only one who, as a male, could have run for office or vote, but he's living in Washington, D.C., which means he can't do either of those things. He cannot vote for president. It's national news when he votes for president for the first time in 1848.
Wow.
Because Arlington County has been retroceded from D.C. into Virginia, so he can now vote for president. There's residents of Washington, D.C. couldn't vote for president until the 20th century. So, it becomes national news. He's a big Zachary Taylor fan, as is Nellie. They think Zachary Taylor is the second coming of George Washington because he's a military hero, basically.
Some of them thought Andrew Jackson was the second coming of George Washington.
Yes, they also loved Andrew Jackson, which the fact that these people are formerly high Federalists doesn't really make sense. But in the sense that Jackson is a military hero, and one of Jackson's sort of wards adopted children marries Nellie's daughter. And so they have that family connection too. Right.
And then Patty Custis Peter has a daughter born in 1815 with a great name of Britannia Wellington Peter.
Yes. And I mean, this is telling because that Wellington is not neither of those names are random. I mean,
No,
this is
yeah.
several months after the British, with Wellington's troops,
Hmm.
have burned Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
which Patty watched happen
Mm.
from the hill in Georgetown,
Hmm.
comes down and meets the soldiers several days later, is like,
Hmm.
oh, they were such gentlemen, and then names her daughter Britannia Wellington.
She had
So,
earlier had two daughters, one named Columbia and one named America. So
right.
these aren't just random names she's choosing.
Right. Although interestingly, with her son's names, she doesn't do this.
Yeah.
She has typical boys'
Yeah.
names
Yeah.
for them, but for the daughters, yes, she has these unusual names, and she is definitely very pro-English, even
Oh, yeah.
when the English are burning
Yeah.
Washington.
Yeah. Because they see the French as also the enemy, and that and then Britannia lives until the 20th century, which is an amazing thing.
Yeah, Britannia lives a really long time, and she stays at Tudor Place during
Hmm.
that time. That house actually stays in the family until late in the 20th century before it becomes a museum.
Mm.
And so she has a lot of family stories and reminiscences
Hmm.
that she and her grandchildren end up recording. And there's a published version of that by Grant Quatermass that came out
Hmm.
soon enough before my book that I was able to cite it, fortunately.
Right, good.
So she has a lot of good stories
Yeah.
that, she either heard from her mother or experienced herself with
Hmm.
meeting these people.
Wow, it's amazing. And George Washington leaves Mount Vernon to a Washington nephew, Bushrod Washington, Justice of the Supreme Court. And there does seem to be a schism between the Custises and the Washingtons. You might note that at the dedication of the Washington Monument, only Washington, people named Washington, are invited, none of the Custises, even though they're
Yeah,
the ones who had the closer connection.
right. Well, so there's a couple things happening there. So when Bushrod inherits Mount Vernon, the Custis siblings basically have to leave their home. Wash
Mm.
and Nellie are still living in that house at the point that
Hmm.
Martha dies in 1802 and Bushrod shows up. And they are
Hmm.
apparently not very polite to him when he
Yeah.
shows up. I will say, though, that after he actually moves in and, he's living fairly close to Nellie, they do have a friendly
Hmm.
relationship. They have dinner with each other sometimes.
Hmm.
They do keep in touch with some of the Washington cousins. Now, the Washingtons, you'd think having that last name would also be
Hmm.
famous
Yeah.
and could be claiming Washington's legacy, but they choose not to.
Hmm.
Bushrod does not he seems to want to be known on his own terms.
Right.
And in his obituary, it doesn't even mention that he was related to George
Really.
Washington.
Mm.
So that's partially a choice by the Washingtons. By the time we get to the dedication of the Washington Monument in the 1880s, I don't think that's necessarily about a schism between the Washingtons and Custises as much as it is about the public has forgotten who the Custises are.
Hmm.
And the obvious thing if you're finding Washington's family members is to look for people with the same
Right.
last name.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the reason for that forgetting has a lot to do with the Civil War.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that is because Wash's only white daughter marries Robert E. Lee.
Ah.
And Robert E. Lee makes the decision, which other Southern
Mhm.
West Point officers did not make, to side with the Confederacy.
Right.
And to the extent that the North is controlling memory of the Civil War,
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
is a treasonous
Right.
act that severs. He had been tied to George Washington through his
Yeah.
marriage to the Custises. That sort of severs the
Mm-hmm.
Custises from Washington's legacy,
Mm.
at least for people in the North. And that memory seems to sort of
Mm.
predominate. And so I think that's part of how the family sort of falls
Mm.
out of favor. Also, the four siblings had all died by then, and
Right.
their children do not seem as interested in carrying this on. They
Right.
don't have as much of the objects necessarily.
Mhm.
Some of that stuff some of it was taken from Arlington House by the
Yeah.
government. Some of
Mhm.
it was sold to the Smithsonian.
Mhm.
At Tudor Place, they still had this stuff. Britannia is
Yeah.
probably the only one who's still sort of famous as a
Mhm.
Washington relative at
Yeah.
this point.
Interesting. We're talking with Cassandra Good, historian, author of First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America, which looks at these extraordinary grandchildren of Martha Washington, adopted children of George Washington, and their legacy in the early Republic. And Wash also, when Mount Vernon then is taken over by Bushrod Washington, they do try to buy up a lot of the Washington memorabilia and then keep it and become curators. And Custis really does seem to become the public face of this, the wanting to present George Washington. He's really doing a lot to perpetuate a legacy, which it doesn't seem like the Washington legacy would need perpetuating, but having this some person with a direct tie to Washington is very important in the early Republic.
Right. And this idea of these relics that are almost like sacred relics because George Washington has touched them. You didn't go to Mount Vernon for those. Mount Vernon is basically empty when Bushrod inherits it, because by the terms of Martha's will, she had said all the contents of the house would be sold at auction and the proceeds would pay for some nephew's education.
Right.
And Wash buys the most stuff. Partially they're buying stuff to furnish their new homes, but he's clearly buying more than he needs. And he doesn't even have a house yet. He has basically a cabin at this point that this stuff is crammed into.
Wow.
And he's not going to have a finished house to display it in until 1818. So, but that is Arlington House. Once it's done is where people are coming to see the actual Washington relics, to hear stories from his so-called adopted son. Everybody knows this is not his biological son, but they see him as the person that was so close, like probably had the closest contact to George Washington.
And then you also note some of the connections with, Billy Lee, who say is the most famous enslaved person of the Revolution. He was Washington's valet manservant, and he's in a lot of the paintings of the time. And then two of his nephews, one of them runs off with the British in 1814 when they're coming up the Potomac. And the other one, Philip, is there when Lafayette returns for a visit. Lafayette spends time with each of these Custis grandchildren in 1824 and 25.
Yeah, Lafayette's visit becomes a chance for them to sort of raise their star power again through association, because there's so much media coverage of that visit. And when Lafayette sees Philip Lee, he recognizes him, even though he's never met him, because he looks like his uncle William or Billy Lee. And Philip is serving as sort of, it sounds like a butler at Arlington House. His mother, brother, and sister had been separated from him and gone to Woodlawn when that separation happened in 1802 of all the enslaved people. And then, yes, you're right. His brother Michael managed to make it to a British ship in 1814 and get to Nova Scotia. Philip probably gets emancipated at some point, but we're not sure. There's letters suggesting that, discussing from Molly, Wash's wife, to Wash, when are you going to free him? You said you would free him. And so that may happen. Philip is also the one who, whenever Wash sends George Washington's camp tent, this famous revolutionary camp tent, for display somewhere, Philip is the one who takes it and gets it set up and knows how to do that. So Philip shows up in the news at various points because of that.
Yeah, he was Washington. And that tent is now in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. It's their kind of central artifact.
Right, a part of it. There's actually multiple tents. And so the Smithsonian has other parts of it, and Yorktown has another part. And the best place to see it, is in Philadelphia.
And then you have it, they set it up in Yorktown for Lafayette's visit. They have a collation inside it. And there's so much great stuff in the book. We're talking with Cassandra Good, author of First Family, about George Washington's descendants and what they do in the early Republic. Now, in 1857, when Wash dies, he does free his enslaved people, but then his executor is Robert E. Lee, kind of drags his feet on doing anything about this.
Yeah, the terms of the will are that Wash's debts need to be paid off, and the money needs to be distributed to his grandchildren before the enslaved people are freed. And his finances are a mess. And so Lee, partly is not that interested in emancipating people, and partly wants to make sure his kids get all this money. He doesn't want his kids getting hurt. So he actually goes to court to try and delay this. And basically they say, the will said within 5 years. Interestingly, 5 years falls at the Emancipation Proclamation. So they're sort of some disagreement among scholars who've looked at this. What has actually freed them? I mean, Lee writes the orders to free these people a couple days before the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Who knows if they even got that before the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't appear to be applied evenly in Arlington County either. But yes, that's messy, and it makes the news. It makes Lee look really bad.
Yeah.
The other thing Lee does, it's not just that he says, okay, I'm going to drag my feet on this. He wants to make as much money as possible off of these enslaved people. So he hires them out. He separates every family but one on the estate. And before, those families had been kept together and even recorded with last names. So there was an awareness of family groups. Lee doesn't care about that.
Wow.
When people try, there's a couple of people that try to leave for freedom and are caught, and Lee has them whipped and have brine poured on their back.
Oh my God.
This also makes the news. So, he denies that he's doing anything wrong here, but this again is not making the Custis family look great in the North.
No. Wow. And yes, so the Civil War, great. I mean, you have these two big nation-splitting cataclysms in their lifetime: the War of 1812, Civil War. And in the War of 1812, you have Wash going to see Dolly Madison just before the British are invading Washington. All of them have things to say about the British burning of the capital city, but he goes there to tell her to make sure she gets the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington out of the house.
Yeah, supposedly this is what happens here. And it's interesting because Montpelier has an article on their website about all the different versions of the story of who is really the one who saved this. I think it's quite likely that Wash did ride over there. It was not far for him to go in and say, yeah, make sure you save this portrait. He's not the one physically rolling it up, but it is interesting that he's part of.
To save it, he could have done that.
Well, but it does make him part of this famous story, which he usually isn't. He's also manning a cannon at Bladensburg.
Yeah. None of these grandchildren do have military service, which is the thing that brings George Washington, of course, to our attention. But Jackie is kept out of the army, and then he dies at Yorktown in 1781 of a fever, and then Wash shows up at Bladensburg and wants to serve, but he has rheumatism, so he can't actually hold a musket or rifle.
Well, he did technically have a commission that George Washington got for him in 1799 when the Quasi-War looked like it was going to break out. So he did a little bit of drilling, and he had a uniform. He was very excited about the uniform. He had a sword that George Washington gave him, which he later gave to Robert E. Lee. But he never actually. The only action he sees, is at Bladensburg, where he goes, but he's not actually officially enlisted.
It's a fascinating story. We're talking with Cassandra Good, historian, writer, author of First Family, about the Washington descendants and their lives in the early republic, and a lot of terrific stories in this. You've given you a chance to tell a lot of them. Any others we should tease people with, or to get them? And we don't want to give everything away that's in the book, because it's such a great book filled with great stories.
Well, I think that there's some good stories about George Washington's courtship advice to his granddaughters.
That's true.
That humanize him. And, people can read that in the book and even see a picture of one of those letters. Because he actually gives individualized courtship advice to his granddaughters. He recognizes there's particular traits. And Nellie is the one who's saying she's determined to be a spinster, is what she says. And he's like, not so fast. You can't control whether you fall in love.
That's right.
And so that correspondence is really great.
Yeah. And she marries a man who's a surprise to them, that Lawrence is the one she falls in love with.
Yeah. And it's a little hard to understand because, frankly, she had a lot of options. And I do think part of it with Lawrence came down to the fact that he was related to the family and that she'd be able to stay close to Mount Vernon. The other thing that happens, she had been sort of turning him down repeatedly, and then he gets a commission in the army and she thinks he's going to leave. And that's the point at which she's like, oh, wait. So, I think, from what I can tell later, it's not necessarily a happy marriage. He has not had the kind of education that she had. He's not an intellectual. She wants to live in the city. He doesn't.
Yeah.
So, and after he dies, I never see a mention of him again in her papers.
Wow. Wow. How much longer does she live after he passes?
She lives more than a decade afterwards.
Wow. Wow. And you have an interesting story when Lafayette visits, that she renews her relationship, her friendship with George Washington Lafayette. And Lafayette is another of these adopted sons of Washington. And George Washington Lafayette had lived in Mount Vernon in the 1790s and then comes back in the 1820s. And she's writing these letters to and about him, saying, no one's ever looked at me with those eyes except my grandmother. I mean, we're thinking back on.
Yeah. I mean, these letters, they are long and they're emotional. And there are times where she says, don't worry, nobody else is seeing this letter. I mean, I wrote a whole book on friendships between men and women. And so, I'm not going to jump to say that there's a physical relationship here, but I do think she, at the very least, had a crush on him at this stage. And, she's in an unhappy marriage. And here's this guy who apparently is treating her differently. And, he's married, he's going back to France. There's nothing that's going to come of this, but she keeps up these long letters to him for a few years.
Wow. And they're both middle-aged people at this time with families and all.
I mean, that doesn't mean that nothing happened. It's still possible, but.
Well, again, in your book on founding friendships, you talk a lot about these relationships that people have that I think we jump to a lot of conclusions today from this. I should also mention that Cassandra Good also has produced the great course on America's Founding Women, which is well worth watching. And so tremendous way of looking at this period and finding out things about people we thought we knew, these human relationships between and among these various individuals in this period. Anything else we should talk? I mean, we could go on all day, but I know you have a life to get to. And
I really appreciated the conversation. And I hope people will think more about historical figures in the context of their families and not just in isolation.
That's true. That's where we all live. So I want to thank Cassandra Good for joining us, author of First Family, as well as Founding Friendships and the Great Courses series, America's Founding Women. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, who is our producer, and many friends and listeners around the world. We thought we'd have a handful of folks around Massachusetts listening in, but we have listeners in Brisbane, Australia, and both Plymouth in Montserrat and Plymouth in Massachusetts, and in Sudbury, Massachusetts, Nuremberg, Delhi, India, and Escanaba, Michigan, and places between and beyond. If you're one of these places, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org. He'll send you one of our Revolution 250 tchotchkes. And I want to thank Cassandra again, Professor Good, I should say. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.